Happy Monday. Garfield's least favourite day for some reason. I have no idea why a cat who is at leisure all week hates Mondays. But anyway, there it is. So what I thought we'd talk about today. So obviously what's going on over summer, I've already said this, we've got lots of lobbying for Rachel Reeves. Rachel Reeves' big task this summer is working out which taxes are safe to monkey about with in order to plug the latest gap caused by the increase in the cost of borrowing, because we have a historically high level of national debt, and of course Rachel Reeves raised that further in order to pay for some infrastructure for the first time in over a decade. So this leads into an interesting question. So first of all, Gordon Brown, as some of you will know, last week, or was it the week before, was talking about, well, you know, putting a hefty tax on online gambling would then allow us to raise enough to get rid of the two-child cap on universal credit. This gambling tax will, by the way, definitely be coming. I mean, there's what happens is, and this happened last year as well. So what Rachel Reeves will be doing, and I'll be keeping an eye on this, it's not going to be a surprise. You know, I've heard various groups saying, oh, how some of the measures in last year's budget were a surprise. And I thought, which one was a surprise? Because all the big ones I knew about, because they were leaked over summer. And the reason Reeves does that, so whenever they've sort of made a decision, they sort of leak it for two reasons. First of all, so that nobody gets caught off guard, because she doesn't want to cause a wobble in the gilt market. But secondly, there's an extent to which you want to test the waters as well, you know. So where people are basically taking it as read, there's definitely going to be this tax on online gambling. Whether it gets used for what Gordon Brown is suggesting it gets used for is another matter, because Reeves's first job, before she can work out how to, before she can increase the amount of public spending, she first of all has to plug the gap. She has to plug the hole first. Now, how easy that is to do depends on how big the hole is. So recently, a think tank suggested they think the hole has widened to about £41 billion. There's talk of £51 billion, but that's because of headroom. So the other 10 billion is not real. It's just for headroom purposes, which you want. But the actual hole itself, they reckon, is 41 billion. Now, I've seen various economics experts and writers suggesting that if it really is 41 billion, Reeves is going to have a tough time of it. However, if it's 25 billion, I've seen some suggestions that that is actually not nearly as bad. And there are ways to deal with that. But the online gambling tax is very interesting because it creates a lot of discussions about the fundamental nature of the economy, because a lot of people, there's lots of people talking about the economy, the great and the good, all talking about it, and tax policy and stuff like that. And there's a lot of things that they're fundamentally misunderstanding. Take Dan Needle, for example. So tax lawyer, right? So he reckons that the amount of tax that Gordon Brown and others think that could be raised from this online gambling tax, he thinks it's probably an overestimate, that it won't raise as much as people are suggesting. So I'm reading things like that, and my first instinct there, the first thing I thought of was, doesn't matter, mate. It's irrelevant. Think about what Rachel Reeves has got to do this. See, the way Dan Needle is approaching it, and the way a lot of people approach it, is they think, so Rachel Reeves has certain spending plans, right? So there's a certain amount of money she's committed to spending. And some of that spending obviously has to be to pay off the national debt. In other words, pay out gilt yields, right? So you need to assign money for servicing the national debt. And you can't not set that money aside. Otherwise, if gilt investors even think you're not prioritising that money, then they're not going to want to invest in the gilt market, because that, you're making their shares worthless. So the government absolutely have to set aside money to pay those yields. And when the cost of that goes up, basically when there's any sort of hit to the global economy, which is going to impact Britain, as has been happening, and it means investors are a bit shakier, then they have to offer better returns on those bonds, those gilts. So that increases the overall cost of borrowing. And that's the hole that Reeves has to fill in. But the reason she's going to have this adjustment this autumn is not because she doesn't think she's got enough money to pay it out. It's because the computer says no. So what all this is based on, we have to understand a couple of things about the way this budget works. The first thing it's based on is the OBR forecast. That's the big thing. So this hole in the finances may not even be real. Like they say, oh, there might be a 40, 50 billion pound hole. There might not be a hole at all. No one knows. Literally no one knows. Because it's based on not an annual thing. It's not like Reeves this year's spending is 40, 50 billion pounds short. Of course it's not at all. It's that in 5 years' time it might be. Based on an economic forecast for 5 years' time. But think about this. Based on that 5-year forecast, which keeps being adjusted, the Treasury, like the Chancellor specifically, produces an adjustment to the budget. So Rachel Reeves produced a budget last year, right, last October, and she said, that's it, that's the budget for the whole Parliament. That's it. That was her entire spending plans. But she had to adjust it this spring, that went badly. She's going to have to adjust it again this autumn. Ask yourselves, why are we adjusting the budget twice? Now, she may only adjust it once. She absolutely should do that, by the way. But think to yourself, if we're adjusting it based on the changing 5-year forecast, why, if we're going to use a 5-year forecast, why don't we just adjust the budget every 5 years? I mean, if the government want to change their spending plans, then sure, yeah. But given that the government don't want to change their spending plans, they're only doing this to make the OBR say, yes, the figures are balanced over 5 years. So if we're going to base a budget on a 5-year forecast, why don't we just not adjust it for 5 years? And people may say, well, the forecast could be wrong. At which point you have to say, well, if the forecast is going to be that wrong, why are we using it? Because that's the problem. We're adjusting twice a year, but using a 5-year forecast. And it also feeds into this idea that economists don't know what they're doing. You get it in the media all the time. Well, economists don't know, if they keep getting it wrong, they keep adjusting, it means they don't know what they're doing. But it's like, no, they do, but you can't adjust, you can't forecast for 5 years' time. Compare it to a weather forecast. People accept that weather forecasts are accurate. They're decent. We knew this heat wave was coming before it happened. Make sure you check up on people, by the way, with that. But no one would expect a meteorologist to tell you what the weather's going to be like in 5 years' time. That would be madness. People completely accept the science behind meteorology. They completely accept that it's a really good system. Yes, it has margins for error, but by and large, it's very accurate. Incredibly accurate, in fact. But no one would say we want to have the forecast for 5 years' time or weather forecast 5 years' time. And it's the same thing with economics. You can't expect them to work out what the state of the economy is going to be like exactly, like roughly maybe, but not exactly, in 5 years' time, to an accuracy of literally a few billion pounds. Rachel Reeves changed the budget in spring. She adjusted the budget in spring based on literally a few billion. I mean, that's way below the margin for error. And the margin for error is very small, by the way. It's 0.9%. That's a marvellous. I cannot tell you how low that is. Usually, scientifically speaking, anything less than 5% error we think is decent. So 0.9% is fantastic. But nonetheless, there is still that error. So that's the first thing you look at. The purpose of this adjustment is not because Rachel Reeves needs to find more money. It's because she just needs this unicorn, this fantasy 5-year forecast to say the numbers are balanced. which is why, going back to what Dan Needle says about he thinks it's an overestimate, makes no difference. It doesn't matter whether it's an overestimate or not. It's irrelevant how much money it raises. Doesn't matter if it doesn't raise a penny. Doesn't matter. What matters is, what do the OBR calculate it will raise? That's what matters. And then you think about some other part of it. So this then goes into tax policy. Now, of course, there's lots of people calling for, the right wing, of course, are calling for spending cuts. That's what they want. The Times are even going, oh, the reason Reeves is in this mess is because she just won't be honest about the fact what we need is massive spending cuts. Right? But that's their view. Those of us on the left have a different view. So we will say, well, no, we need this amount of money, and therefore we need to increase the level of tax. And the only real question for those of us on the left is, where does the burden fall? Because a lot of us would go, it needs to fall on those who can most afford it. And this is where you have to really understand the nature of what you mean by the economy. Now, the economy, just as a definition, is literally just a system of trade. That's all. When you talk about the economy, what does an economy mean? It's the system you use to trade. That's what an economy is. And economics is the study of trade. There's nothing more to it than that. So and I think where a lot of people go wrong in terms of thinking about tax policy is they think there's such a thing as the UK economy, when there isn't, doesn't exist. It's an illusion. We don't use, because it's a system of, remember, the economy is a system of trade. We don't trade with ourselves, as in we don't trade exclusively with ourselves. Our trade system is global. We use the world economy. It's not realistic to shut ourselves off from the world. We cannot realistically put up a big wall around us and own, because we can't possibly be self-sufficient. We certainly can't be self-sufficient to the point where the general population would be satisfied if we tried to do so, but we can't anyway. We physically cannot be self-sufficient. So we use the world trade system. At which point, once you understand that, then you understand, so when you change a tax policy, the UK government doesn't have, when people talk about the fact we need to rewire the UK economy, they're talking about something that's an illusion. So because they think to themselves, well, it's the UK economy, so the government have complete control of the UK economy. No, they don't, because there's no such thing as the UK economy. Who's popping there? So we're neither food or energy sufficient. We're not sufficient for anything. Raw materials, nothing. We're literally not self-sufficient on anything. In theory, actually no, I was going to say in theory we might be able to go back to a time when we had a sort of medieval existence, but even then the population's too large. And of course, if we did go back to that sort of subsistence farming model, we would be invaded. We would be invaded. So we're not sufficient. We're really not self-sufficient on any resource at all. Maybe a little bit water, but even then, to maintain the water supplies, we need other things importing. But this idea of a UK economy is a fabrication. Or when we talk about the UK economy, all it means is, what are the numbers for the trade between the UK and the rest of the world? That's it. But there's no, and those numbers are real. You can work those numbers out. But beyond that, there is no such thing as the UK economy. It's just part of the overall economy, the world economy. And it's the reason why people will think about the UK economy is because to most people, it looks real. And that's because most people can't go beyond these illusionary boundaries. But rich people can. So tax policy then leads into this idea. So what happens? So when you come back to the online gambling tax thing, so what are the consequences? The consequences of increasing a tax on an industry are usually that because they need to maximize profits, they will seek to reduce their levels of staffing. They'll try and use technology and things like that. And then you think, well, online gambling does that anyway. online gambling specifically doesn't employ that many people. It does employ like several thousand, it's something like 10,000 nationally. But the whole point of online gambling is to reduce the need for staffing. You use technology, lots of automated systems and all the rest of it. So then you think to yourself, so why didn't someone do this earlier then? Why wasn't it done earlier? And you can think to yourself, well, you can understand why the Tories didn't, because they just don't like taxing anyone, and it's probably there's probably some Tory donors who run the online gambling industry and they didn't want it. But and then you can go with that. But then you think to yourself, but why didn't Rachel Reeves do it last year? Because remember, any taxes she raises this year, she didn't intend to. It's reactionary. She intended, she knew, I mean, obviously she's not an idiot. She knows that things can be adjusted or needs to be adjusted. But when she announced her, I've just done it again. Put your hand down, you fool. When she announced her budget last year, she said, and she intended it to be the budget for the whole Parliament. Any adjustments would only be down to unforeseen circumstances. Not necessarily unforeseeable, you can foresee lots of things, but unforeseen ones we don't know about. So she looked at the situation last year. She did take her time as well. Remember, normally a new government pushes out a budget really quite quickly. She took her time. She took several months. And so you think to yourself, so why didn't she say, oh, online gambling, that would be a useful area to tax? Because if you think about it, it's online gambling. First of all, it doesn't employ a right load of people because of its nature. Secondly, and also it's an industry which is naturally geared towards doing without employees anyway. The whole concept of online, any service that's online, the people running it are always thinking about, I mean, they use technology, so they're not going to be too flush with their employees, right? As opposed to something where it was like a high street gambling shop, a betting shop, then at that point, you know, you might have more employees there than you strictly need. Whereas for online, the focus is very much on doing without employees. So you're not likely to risk anyone's jobs by taxing them a bit more. Or it's a lower risk than for a lot of businesses. Also, gambling is harmful. It's like smoking and drinking, where the government are... Drinking usually is a bit more politically charged, but smoking certainly, governments have in the past been more than happy, it's just been almost automatic, Labour or Conservative governments, to raise the taxes on tobacco, justified by the fact it's harmful and we're trying to sort of dissuade people to not smoke, right? And gambling, same sort of thing. Particularly if you can link it to spending on some of the harmful byproducts of gambling. So it's a really obvious one. And you know, and you think, so why didn't she do it last year then? And it's really because of the way the Treasury is set up. You know, the whole again, we sometimes on this channel talk about the lessons from Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. But I'm going to say there's at least one phrase in Yes Prime Minister that is completely wrong. I don't know whether it was right at the time, but it's completely wrong these days. And it's when Humphrey said that the way taxation works is the Treasury pitches for as much money as it can get and then works out how to spend it. He said that the Treasury doesn't work out what it wants to spend and then work out how to pay for it. It pitches for as much money as it can get and then works out what to spend it on. Now, I don't know whether that ever was the case, but it is definitely not the case now. It is certainly not the case now. And we know that because of this online gambling tax thing, because if the Treasury was geared up to trying to work out how to raise as much tax as possible, that would have been it was such an obvious one to go for, and they didn't do it. Unlike some other taxes, like there's lots of other taxes you can say, like, for example, putting up employers' national insurance contributions. It was known that that would have a negative impact. I mean, people overblew the negative impact, but it was going to have a negative impact. We knew that at the time. Lots of taxes can have a negative impact. But this online gambling one, it's not perfect because, again, it could, but it's really low risk. Very low risk. because you're talking about an industry that mostly has very few employees, does its stuff with technology. So you will just be squeezing their profits a bit. So, why wasn't it considered last year? Because the Treasury is geared towards leaving taxes, towards raising as little tax as possible. That's what I'm thinking here. Anyway, I'll go through some comments here. Be interesting if the government get into loot box mechanics in games. That's considered gambling in places like Belgium. Yes, no, absolutely. So I play a number of games that have this, and it is gambling, and I think it should be severely curtailed. I really do. So for those who don't know, there are some games, I play some of them, that have what are called loot boxes. And these can contain random items. They could be cosmetic items, which are highly desirable. They could be other more practical items, but they're items for you to use in game. And they're random, they're mystery boxes, that is the point. And you purchase them with in-game currency. Now, in-game currency can be earned just by, you usually, if you have a subscription to these games, get a certain amount of that currency anyway. And in some games, you can earn the currency by playing it. But, of course, you can also buy with real-world money extra in-game currency, which you can then use to purchase these lock boxes. And it is gambling because you do not know what you're getting. You literally get in a box. You know the sorts of things it might contain. They publish that. They publicise the sort of items that may be in it. And you know some of those items are fairly common, so they're likely to be in it if you get enough of them. Some of them are very rare. And, of course, the very rare ones are the most desirable ones. And you can see how, for someone who really wants a particular item, that it can encourage them to spend more real world money than they would like to in pursuit of it, right? It is gambling, and I think it should be treated as such, and I think there should be legislation to at least restrict it. You should, at the very least, I mean, I don't like the concept of them at all. I occasionally get them myself, but I don't get too many. I get really very rare, but occasionally, yes, it's. So maybe you restrict how many of these loot boxes an account can purchase per month, something like that. But yes, I mean, that's not something that I think the government should look at taxing, by the way. But as we're talking about gambling, you say Belgium classes it as gambling. It is gambling. It is gambling, and it should be considered gambling legally everywhere. Yeah, who's popping there saying, oh, game publishers like Wargaming are making hundreds of millions in untaxed revenue. So it shouldn't be untaxed because any profit they make should be taxed, by the way. So there's nothing about the nature of the revenue they generate from loot boxes which should give it a tax break. At the end of the day, a gaming company like, of the sort that produce these sort of games, they get their money from subscriptions, in-game purchases of currency. The loot boxes are, I'm not saying for absolutely every single game, but for most games, you don't pay directly for the loot box. But even if you did, that's still, in Age of Conan, for example, you can pay for direct items, not loot boxes, but actual direct. They have loot boxes as well, but you can have actual items. But again, it's all, any money they get is still supposed to be audited. So there's no reason why this should allow tax breaks. I don't know how that would possibly work. Hope the tax on tobacco and vape profit margins that my MP likes goes in the budget. Well, I actually don't know what happens these days, because it used to be the case that almost literally, not every year, but almost every year, you would get an increase in tax on tobacco, because it was such an easy one to do. It's like it was justified on the fact that it was harmful and we're trying to stop people smoking, but without banning it. But it was also a really good source of revenue, right? But and again, the same thing you can say with gambling, particularly online gambling, which can't employ that many people. I think as I say, I tried to look it up. I think it's about 10,000 across the entire country. And yet it makes billions and billions. Surely we're reaching a point where the role of the RBR needs to be looked at because they're preventing things we desperately need just because they won't think about returns on investment. We're not, unfortunately. You are right that the OBR is a problem. The OBR, remember, was created by the Conservatives to justify economically dodgy. They set up the OBR. They created the OBR. George Osborne created the OBR so that he could, and they had a mandate to basically say that the budget was balanced, which is literally, these are our spending plans, these are our tax plans, the numbers match. And that was it. Now, the problem with that is, as you say, and this is the problem, it's not that they don't try to take into account the return. It's just that they don't feel... It's really weird. Like I've just been saying earlier, that it's a complete nonsense to expect. I mean, they are top economists, by the way. They know their stuff. The people at the OBR are not mugs. They're not idiots. They haven't dragged them in off the street. But it's not realistic to expect them to come up with a forecast for over 5 years. And yet that's what they've been expected to do. But here's where the problem is. Although they are expected to come up with a budget forecast 5 years from now, they are not expected to, or they are allowed to be more realistic in terms of judging the returns. So it's not that they don't judge the returns, it's just that they tend to be quite conservative on what those returns are because they don't want to be too generous with them. From their point of view, it's better to be too conservative than too generous, because if you're too generous by a long way, like if you're too conservative by a long way, then the government just has to do what Rachel Reeves is doing now and either cut spending or raise taxes, both of which she's attempted at various points this year. Whereas if you're excessively generous in the returns that you get and you don't get them, that's when you risk a shortfall where you then risk the country not being able to pay its debt. So that's the worry, that you end up with a deficit that goes out of control like in America. America only gets away with it, or it's only got away with it so far, because it is the dominant economy and has the world's reserve currency. That gives it huge leeway. But we don't have that in this country. So that's the reason. But yes, the OBR is a problem. If we didn't have the OBR, then we wouldn't have had those attempted disability cuts this year, or it's very, very unlikely because I don't think they were planned. We wouldn't have this later on this year, this readjustment. You know, Rachel Reeves would have basically come up with her own assessment. She said, this is my budget. She'd have still needed to make it look plausible to gilt investors, but she would be the one running the numbers on it. So you would be using Treasury estimates for the returns, right? And as long as they seemed feasible, then you'd be fine. Adam, they're saying almost all of these online games rip you off. Play several where the default currency is US dollars, but when charged with GB pounds nearly the same, will above the exchange rates. It depends on them. Some of them do work like that, yeah. But at the end of the day, I mean, I play several of these games, and they are the gambling. The loot boxes is gambling, and it feeds into people's weaknesses, and that should be legislated against. But generally speaking, like, it's a game, and you don't have to buy the extra currency. You don't need the stuff. In a lot of these games, you don't even need the subscription, but I always play with a subscription because it's always shit without it. So I don't mind that. At the end of the day, my main focus in terms of rip-offs is essential services and goods, right? Things that people need. So if I'm going to be concerned about rip-offs in any part of our economy, it's going to be on things like water, energy, food, transport, things like that. They're saying I used to love Age of Conan. I tried recently to get into it again, and it's still, I first got it and it was the first part of it's really good. And everything's voice acting, it looks marvellous. And then as soon as you leave the starting area, like, no voice acting, everyone's silent. And it's like, this is a game where you didn't even finish Like it's never got any better. It's a shit game. It really is. But anyway, Path of Exile as microtransaction with cosmetics only. Yes, there are some that do. There are some that do. And again, they're fine because you know what you're getting. The problem is the mystery box, because you'll want a thing. It's like if you want a thing, you want a cosmetic, you look how much it is, you go, is that reasonable? Either it is or it isn't. If it isn't, you don't get it. If it is, yeah, and you get it. It's the mystery box. If you're after something, particularly if you're after something rare, and you might get lucky and then you might not, and you get into a sunk cost fallacy where, you know, you spend 50 quid, well, why not spend 100? Or you spent 100 quid, why not 200? And the more you spend, the more it's like, well, the law of statistics should be on my side. I must not have to spend much more to get it now, which is completely wrong, of course. Your probability of getting it with each box does not increase the more boxes you buy and fail with. It's the same every single time. But that is why I do think it should be legislated for. But anyway, last couple here. You compared 5-year forecast to meteorology. What you're suggesting is like meteorologists who makes a long-term forecast, ignoring global warming effects and glacier collapsing. Well, not really, because it doesn't matter what you do, you cannot tell me what the weather's going to be like here in 5 years' time. Doesn't matter what model you use. You can't do it. When AI powers up and can do these things even more accurately, it will not be able to tell me what the weather's going to be like in 5 years' time. And it's the same with the economy. The economy is even less predictable because it's not just based on scientific phenomena, but I mean, climate also is based on human behavior, but the human behavior is over the more long term. Whereas you can have a significant change to the global economy overnight. Trump announces tariffs, bang, massive hits to the global economy straight away overnight, just because of one dingbat. But there we go. Saying, I thought Phil bought a bigger sword than Penny with our pennies. I already had the sword before Penny, by the way, Penny Mordaunt. I just started displaying it when she got hers out because I thought I'm not being upstaged by her. But there it is. But there it is. We'll leave it there. Thanks very much for coming on, everyone. Have a great rest of day. And until next time, I'll see you later.